Good morning and welcome to this Hudson Institute discussion on the impact of Chinese sanctions on British MPs. I'm Emma Murphy, US correspondent for ITV News, and I've covered the plight of the Uyghur people extensively in the UK, the US, and also Turkey. Now, to give you a little background on what we're here to discuss today, it was in March this year that the British, American, some EU and also Canadian governments decided to sanction two individuals from the Chinese Communist Party for what they saw was their part in the orchestration of genocide against the Uyghur people in China. Shortly after those sanctions were put in place, China retaliated, placing sanctions on lawmakers and academics in the UK, the US, Canada, Germany, and other parts of the European community. Now, this was very much seen as an attempt by China to warn the West not to interfere in what they see as their domestic affairs. And human rights are very much seen as something that China wants to deal with privately and internally. But if the attempt was to warn politicians off, that was not the consequence, because many felt more committed to redouble their efforts to work on behalf of the Uyghur people. Now, today we are joined by two of those MPs, both of whom are living under Chinese sanctions in the UK. We are joined by Sir Iain Duncan Smith, MP and former Conservative Party leader, and MP Nusrat Ghani, both the members of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, and both are very welcome here, and we're grateful for your time today. First of all, though, could I hand over to Nury Turkel, a fellow at the Hudson Institute, who has a very personal experience of the Uyghur situation.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm delighted to be joined today with Ms. Ghani and Sir Iain Duncan Smith. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for your leadership in addressing human rights abuses in China and dismantling of Hong Kong democracy. The United States and United Kingdom, as two of the world's leading democracies, have the ability to play a unique role in shaping global norms and standards. Both nations have been amongst the earliest to recognize and declare CCP atrocities in the Uyghur region to be genocide, and continue to rally support to stop the ongoing genocidal actions committed by CCP against vulnerable religious ethnic minority. While these steps been taken, welcomed, that we still have a lot to do. Last month at the UK hosted G7, a joint declaration called for China to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, especially in relation to the Uyghur region. However, world's leading democracies must come together with not only with the words, but real actions to stop the CCP abuses committed against the Uyghur people and others. The United States Congress has been taking a leadership role early on. As we speak, there are several bills currently being considered to address the genocide, the ongoing genocide, the enslavement of the Uyghurs in the global supply chain, and humanitarian assistance to the Uyghur refugees, and relocation of next year's Winter Olympics. Though China's behavior may not be easy to sway, steps has to be taken to show that Beijing's action has consequences. The international community should not sit by and allow China to host next year's Winter Olympics while the genocide continues to occur. It can be expected that the CCP will use the games and their ongoing the opening ceremony, as they did in 2008, to normalize the human rights abuses in China. We cannot allow these games to become a mirror of the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. That said, I am grateful that two leaders here today who recognize these concerns and have worked tirelessly to end these horrific abuses. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Nury. So Iain Duncan Smith, if I start with you, perhaps it's important to give us a little context. What was it that you were doing that brought you into the spotlight of the Chinese, so much so that you required sanctions in their view?
Well, I can't answer for them, but what I can do is explain a little bit about how this all came about. It pretty much started a couple of years ago, really, where we, myself and a number of others, started asking questions specifically about a particular government idea, which was to go for what is called 5G telecommunications system in the UK, which is an advance on the existing 4G. Now, previously, a number of us had complained that we were concerned about the nature of China and its involvement in the UK economy, particularly with telecommunications, as this was at the forefront. And we worried about its security because of the nature of what China has been doing and saying, and actually, in terms of cyber, etc. So we started sort of campaigning to try and stop the government moving to the next phase and to review the other part of it alongside a wider range of issues. And this exploded really, I suppose, late in 2019 and then into early 2020 after the general election here, which returned Boris Johnson with a significant majority. And then there were amendments. And the whole argument erupted with the government denying there was any security risk and saying there was no problem, they could handle it. But this carried on embarrassingly for the government. Eventually, about 3 months in, about March, April of last year, the government finally conceded that, in fact, they couldn't award the contract to them because they were a security risk, something we knew already buried in the bowels of the security system. So they reversed their position on that. In the meantime, we had got involved, or I'd certainly got involved much, much more on the human rights issues and as a sort of parallel track. And it occurred to me around about the beginning of 2020 that talking to other people in other countries and other parliamentarians like Nuz and co, that there was a genuine concern, A, about genocide with the Uyghurs, but also long-standing concerns about Tibet, Christians, Falun Gong. And in the midst of that was the trashing of the Hong Kong Sino-British Agreement on Hong Kong. So all of these things started coming together. It occurred to me at the time that what we should try and do is bring together all the kindred spirits on the left of politics and the right of politics in every country. So well aided and abetted by Luke de Pulford, we set up an organization called IPAC, Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which would have 2 co-chairs per country. We've got 20 countries involved now and growing. And then in each country, there are members of IPAC from that parliament. And Nuz is one of the founder members of that. As well. So very quickly that snowballed onto both sides of the house and all around the world, from Japan to America. We have co-chairs now in the Senate in America and in the Japanese Parliament and other countries, and a couple in Africa as well. So all of that is where it's got to. I think all of that and the constant attacks and calling for sanctions, etc., has upset the Chinese and actually a number of people in the UK who seem to be the cheerleaders for almost anything that China does, or as I call them, the excuse-nicks, who seem to get on the airwaves as soon as possible and say, there's nothing wrong with this country and there's nothing wrong with what the government's doing. So that's the constant battle. I'm sure at the end of the day, China's had enough of me. They've already, I think, attacked my systems. They've tried DOS attacks on the IPAC system. So there it goes. And I wasn't surprised when they sanctioned me. I just thought they'd have done it earlier, actually, that's all.
Nusrat Ghani, what about you? What do you feel brought you into the IR? Obviously, there was your great involvement there with IPAC.
Well, it was obviously working with Sir Iain Duncan Smith that unfortunately threw this shade on me. But I must say that for many years, I was concerned about the treatment of the Uyghur. We had a substantial report that talked about the selling of Uyghur organs, as well as other individuals that China did not want to expose. And a few years ago, I joined the UK Select Committee that looked at business and industrial relations. And it focused on supply chain transparency. And in the UK, we are tremendous leaders when it comes to environmental standards and animal welfare standards, and also on certain elements of human rights standards. But I noticed that there was a huge gap when it came to China. We have a set of national laws or international laws, but somehow China does not feel that they have to abide by them. And the rest of the world tends to give them a hall pass, so they don't have to abide by them. In the UK, we have something called the Modern Slavery Act, which is to ensure that our supply chains aren't littered with slave labour. So products aren't on our supermarket shelves that are made from slave labour, and companies aren't profiting from it. And companies in the UK, on the most part, are doing their best to clean up their supply chains. But when it comes to China, and Xinjiang in particular, there's absolutely no visibility whatsoever. So when a fantastic global brand says, you know, guys, our supply chain is clean, we've checked it, there's a hiccup. They haven't checked what the supply chain is doing in Xinjiang, and they're also a little bit anxious to do so as well because they want access to that market. I just wanted to make sure that our national laws that we fight for, legislate for, are being understood by UK companies and practiced internationally, and also that international laws are also dealt with in an appropriate fashion. We can't give China what's the word, a way of getting out of this, because we're all working to one system and China's working to another. I also have done a huge amount of work with the Jewish community in the UK over many years, and more evidence was coming to light that what was being imposed on the Uyghur people, for many people, reflected what happened in the 1930s and 40s, whether it's a 3 ton of human hair that arrives on the American market, whether it's the sterilization of Uyghur women that's led to an 84% reduction in birth rate in one region, whether it's the re-education of hundreds of thousands of Uyghur children. This is fundamentally to break their link with their parents. How barbaric is that? Break their links with their parents, destroy any knowledge of their language, any knowledge of their culture, any identity that is Uyghur. And the fact that this is happening in this day and age, and we are involved in the UK because our supply chains are littered by the products of Uyghur slaves over in Xinjiang. So I got more and more involved, working with Sir Iain, Duncan Smith and many other colleagues across the House. We found a way of really exposing what was happening in Xinjiang and also ensuring that we weren't offering preferential trade deals with country which may be enacting a genocide on their people. So we put down a genocide amendment to the trade deal. And Emma, if I could just backtrack a moment, Sir Iain and I would not be doing any of this if the United Nations was functioning as an international institution. So we rely on the UN to investigate, corroborate, and to prevent a genocide. But the United Nations, when it comes to China, is a broken flush. It is incapable of making any rational decision. So we Sir Iain and myself and colleagues felt that because the UN was broken, that we had to work with our national governments and see how we investigate whether a genocide is taking place. So we did a lot of work in the UK, which was getting a huge amount of traction internationally, but also here with our government. I also sit on the Business Select Committee, which exposed international businesses and their fantastic brands and how they were actually complicit in slave labor in Xinjiang. And those firms wanted to move out of Xinjiang. And I think China wasn't comfortable with these international firms asking questions they did not want to answer. And they wanted to close that conversation down. Working with IPAC, Emma, is crucial because it's a global network of parliamentarians that Iain has set up. It means the work that we do in the UK is then reflected and replicated in other governments around the world. So everything becomes much bigger than just what Sir Iain and I do in the UK. What's important is the sanctions for me were a surprise. I've not been working in this space as long as Sir Iain has. But what the sanctions have done is brought so many parliamentarians and public citizens around the world so much closer to this issue in a much shorter period of time than we could ever have imagined. And Sir Iain and I are now obliged to keep working on this even faster and more furiously than we ever did before.
You spoke there about the powerlessness, you see it, of the UN, Nusrat, and you were talking also about working with other governments. How important is it that countries around the world who share the same belief in human rights actually do show a united front to try and tackle a situation like this?
I think when it comes up against a country like China, we can only work in collaboration, which is why the G7 was such an important moment for so many of us campaigning on this issue. I think it's extremely hard for individual governments to try and be front-footed on this, although I must say the United States has been tremendous on this particular issue. So we were hoping that at G7 there will be collaboration, there will be an understanding of how China uses its power through its investment funds around the world, and we'd have Western Alliance putting together an alternative fund, which has been discussed by the Biden administration, which is fantastic. Also, Emma, we've spent a long time getting to where we are in the West and for our democracies to function, and we've fought incredibly hard for our values, and we cannot now have them washed away with China's vision of how it thinks the world should run and how it thinks it should conduct itself. At some point, we have to say these aren't our values, or we're going to stand up for humankind regardless of where they live in the world. And when it comes to the Uyghur people, this isn't about human rights abuses. This is a completely off the spectrum. It's an erasure of a group of people just because they're Uyghur. It's off the scale what China is conducting against the Uyghur people. And because we're involved, because our supply chains are involved. And it's also an issue about security. And I think Sir Iain can mention that too. We have to at some point say that we in the West have a certain set of principles and international laws, and they're not for sale.
Yeah.
Sir Iain Smith, I know you described the sanctions as a badge of honour when you received news of them. How effective do you think you can be as governments actually trying to tackle the many issues that are coming across the table with regard to China now?
Well, neither of us in government, although we have both been in government. I ran a department for 6 years, so I have an understanding of how government works. So does Nuz. There are others as well in the group that have all been ministers at some stage. So it's not as though we are completely outside. We do understand how this works. And the key thing here is I always think of this sort of process as the war of the flea. We may be small in terms of government power, but what we are doing is constantly to irritate the government, to understand where they've gone wrong and constantly challenge them over it. Now, what's interesting about this is that we had this battle over whether or not the UK government could declare that the Chinese government was guilty of genocide with regards to the Uyghur. And it was a long, long fight, different bills coming back from the House of Lords, and we were trying to get different types of recommendation amended to try and get them to send it to a UK court. And the battle was fierce with the government, and the government was completely compromised during the course of it with the most ludicrous arguments, twisting in knots to try and say that only be a competent court, but accepting that no court at the UN, as it were, could ever be reached because China blocked it, and they're not a member of the International Criminal Court. And then at the same breath saying, oh, but it has to be those courts. And you keep saying, but you can't go there, and you know it. And so what we had is we were able to expose this twisting whirlpool of government complete contradiction, which has made them look really pretty hopeless on this. And then, so you slowly bite away at this, and then to raise the other issues, not just about the Uyghur, but all the other issues that surround China, its behavior, etc., has been the key. And we're still going to carry on with that. So being sanctioned made it a little bit difficult, I thought, for the UK government and for other governments around Europe. In Europe, they actually stopped approving their trade deal, which they had been negotiating with the Chinese. They can't get that through because the European Parliament has said no, because some of their members are sanctioned. In the UK, we've been sanctioned, and the government, said they were furious about this. But I think quietly they still want to do a trade deal. So we've got a large battle on our hands. And the problem is, it's greed and dependency that is the problem here. China has spotted how the West works: cheaper products, cheaper access to technology, and they've sucked the West, the free world in, and the free world's invested massively. It is now very dependent for purchase of products, everything from nuclear through to telecommunications, you name it. We are now pretty much in hock to the Chinese government, and that is growing, not shrinking. And that is what stops us ever saying the right things about China. Yeah, we go through the motions at times, but we still don't do anything about it. That's the key. So it's what are we going to do, not what are we going to say? And the two don't match up.
So just in terms of going forward, what do you need to see from colleagues in the UK, colleagues here in the US, across the world in order to try and tackle this? What is the best way forward?
Shall I pick the first bit up of that, and then those you can pick up the rest? I think the main thing is to shift the dial on our understanding, on our governmental understanding of the nature of the challenge and threat. It's not just a challenge; it is a threat. That China poses a threat on a number of planes to us. It poses a threat on the international human rights order, on the rule of law, and at democracy itself. I just peel those away one at a time. On human rights, well, we can see what's going on in China with the appalling abuses taking place, which I and many believe constitutes genocide with regards to the Uyghurs particularly, but also very similar actions on Tibet, the beginnings of similar actions for the Inner Mongolians. It seems to me there is almost a racial policy existing in China, which dare not speak its name, which is unless you are Han Chinese, then in essence you are a lower order, and therefore you have to be dealt with. Now, this is a pretty shocking position, given that some 75 years ago, we had a global conflict based on those sort of ghastly ideas, and the human rights acts, etc., and the European agreement over human rights. These were all shaped out of the back of that conflict, never to be repeated again, but they are being repeated. So human rights is being challenged, not just in China, but as a result of that abroad, because this gives excuses to all sorts of other governments, intolerant governments around the world, to behave in the same way. Rule of law, well, China trashes that. Look at the Hong Kong agreement, Sino-British agreement. They've trashed that because they didn't want to enact it anymore. They're locking up peaceful democracy campaigners all over the place in Hong Kong. They're now threatening Taiwan, which doesn't want to rejoin China. So that rule of law. And then, as Nuz said quite rightly, on business and trade, the WTO, they behave appallingly because they don't want to do something, they don't do it, and they can't be called to account. And finally, of course, on democracy, China's made it very clear, President Xi, theirs is the perfect form of government. And theirs is a challenge, ideological challenge, because they think democracy is a passing phase, that in truth, the kind of government that does work is theirs, autocratic, undemocratic, and very, very intolerant. That government, they are now proposing through their Belt and Road project, which now they put about $1 trillion into, which is to influence other governments as well to follow suit with their type of government. This is a big threat to what we have complacently assumed was unassailable, which was democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. These are now under attack. To get our governments to understand that has been a big shift. America, Nuz is absolutely right. America has started to pick that up. But the rest of us, countries in Europe and the UK, I'm afraid, are behind the curve on this, and we have more to do.
Nusrat, Ghani?
I think that the other big difference between us and China is that China is fantastic at having a very long-term strategy. And in UK and Europe, we're focused on the 3, 4, 5-year terms, and we don't seem to see the end of our nose. And for me, dealing with the Uyghur issue was fundamentally dealing with democracy. We can see what's happened recently when other governments or parliaments, forgive me, have tried to raise the Uyghur issue, and the influence that China has put on those countries not to raise the issue because there may be a shortfall of a particular kind of health care that they need, or other issues which will be instrumental to their infrastructure and security. So it's a massive, massive threat to the democracy that we fought so hard for, and the international rules-based order. So, but there is something that's also incredibly worrying that Iain's touched on. We recently recognised what took place over 70 years ago in Europe, and we said never again, but it is happening all over again. And there seems to be a sense of powerlessness, Emma, which just makes me despair that we feel that we are incapable of standing up to the destruction of millions of people because so many are afraid of upsetting China. This is no way for us to govern ourselves or to conduct our lives or be optimistic about our children, our future, or our children's future. So we need to try and set this right. I think the easiest way to do this right is, first of all, putting pressure on businesses because they're obsessed about their brand and they're obsessed about transparency in their supply chains and other issues that matter to the customers, such as the environment. So at some point, if Sir Iain and Nury and the rest of us campaign on this for enough time, this will also become an issue that'll be on the tips of people's tongue. The way that climate change is, they'll also be asking about the plight of the Uyghur and other atrocities when it comes to the way businesses conduct themselves. And then we need to work with our partners. We need to work with them faster than we are now, working with the United States in particular, and working out how we can re-establish international institutions so they are working in a democratic and transparent way and not leaning to giving China and Russia what they want, because then I fear that it'll be a slow decay of what we fought for in the West over such a long period of time.
So Ian Duncan Smith, Nusrat mentioned there that the feeling is that China and the West is very much in hock with China. The challenges you've both had in trying to get the government to look at genocide, and the fact that actually, the UN is powerless. The UK currently is hosting the tribunal, which is about the only way that it seems to be possible to have an independent review of whether genocide is taking place or not. Tell me, how difficult is it to try and get people on board with this? Whether we're talking about your colleagues within Parliament, whether we're talking about businesses and business leaders that you're speaking to about their responsibility to actually embrace this issue.
Well, it's actually very difficult. And it's difficult because we come back to the same principle that I think the Chinese government over a period has learnt very quickly what happened to the Soviet Union when eventually it collapsed. And it collapsed really because if you think about it, or for all the military confrontation, the truth was it was the economic side of this which collapsed the Soviet Union. And why was that? It's because up against them was aligned the free world, whose economies were all functioning, worked on the free market and intertraded with each other. The Soviet Union wasn't part of that. And as a result, its economy was very small, reliant pretty much on raw materials with very little else. And of course, then if you add to that, that time, the United States was genuinely leagues ahead of anybody else in terms of its capacity, economic capacity. And then you realize that basically the free world outspent the Soviet Union and they couldn't sustain it anymore and their economy collapsed, and that made a big change. Now, I'm not going to observe anything about Russia as it is at the moment today, but my point is that I think the Chinese government, looking at their own economy, realizing it wasn't growing by anything like fast enough, and the disastrous 5-year plans and the great leap forwards and all these others, which ended up with disgusting levels of people dying of starvation and terrible brutality. I mean, I think the figure is something like 80 million perished in the course of those huge shifts and changes. Realized that without economic growth, they wouldn't be able to do anything. And that was the beginning of the big change under Deng Xiaoping, which brought them into the free market. But without anyone, the free market, but they had no intention of changing the nature of their government. Now, Western governments assumed, and this is the weak Achilles heel of this all, I remember George Osborne saying this at some stage, don't worry, if you open up China to the market will change China. Not at all. Actually, what's happened is the market has allowed them to try and change the rest of us. And I think that's where the problem arises. So the real issue is it's understanding that the weakness now in the free world is this incredible level of dependency on China, which is growing. And what happens with business and politicians is that therefore they then lobby that we can't, because this means factories, it means businesses, it means trade, it means cheaper product. All of this suddenly become the big, powerful commercial interests which lobby against upsetting China on any level at all, which become incredibly powerful. And they are very powerful indeed right now. And the more that happens, the more dependent you become. And so the free world has become incredibly dependent commercially, economically on China. And that is the toughest thing to change. And so we are now, in a way, in a serious problem, because how do you retreat from that after COVID? But I make one final point on this, which I explain endlessly to politicians and business leaders who tell me this. I say, but you never add in the collateral damage of this dependency. Look at COVID. If they had been a reasonable government, then they would have come clean about COVID very much earlier on. And the WHO could have dealt with this so that it didn't get past perhaps Wuhan, let alone China. Instead of which, by being utterly intolerant and by closing ranks, trying to find a way of being able to combat it without coming clean, we have seen millions die around the world. Economies have literally been trashed and people have been plunged into greater poverty. Add the collateral damage up and you can see what happens when your dependency stops you asking serious questions. That's the bit that they still have to get their heads around.
Nusrat Ghani, I know you're under time pressures, so just one last contribution from you, if we could. So Iain there was speaking about the way that everybody has become very interlinked, very dependent within the free world. But of course, one of the big symbols of that is the Olympics, and they are heading to China in 2022, the Winter Olympics. What's your feeling about that?
I'm hoping that the pressure that's been put on corporations to be involved in either sponsorship or promotion will be rethinking what their brand means if they're on the stage at the Olympics in China. I'm hoping that the public around the world and the great British public will continue to ask questions of these global brands and ask them to come clean. And it'll be incredibly difficult for them to try and explain why in their supply chains they have slave labor, Uyghur slave labor, men and women working in factories without any ability to leave. And most recently at the Uyghur tribunal that took place in London, we were shown satellite evidence which showed images of factory-sized crematoriums being built at these prisons and factories. And the question has to be asked of these firms, why are you securing products where factory-sized crematoriums are placed on these factory sites, and make people understand what took place in the 30s and 40s is happening all over again. And if we mean anything by never again, we can't have firms complicit in this form of slave labor. So I'm hoping the businesses will move, and that will then change the narrative completely on what takes place at the Olympics in China.
Thank you for your time, Nusrat Ghani, as you head off and leave us. We'll remain now with Sir Iain Duncan Smith and also Nury Turkel at the Hudson Institute. Nury, perhaps I bring you in here just to give us a view of somebody who is from a Uyghur family. You were born in a prison camp. How important to you, to the Uyghur population, is it that actually countries come together to stand against what are seen as these abuses in China?
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question that goes through my mind almost every day. While I'm personally grateful for the actions, legislative, executive actions that have been taken to date here at home and abroad, I echo Sir Iain Duncan Smith's sentiment that words sometimes meaningless if there's no action followed. So, and this kind of issues should not require us to have a conversation, even urging people to act. This is something that should be no-brainer. This is something that we've been educating our children in an education system, investing resources supposedly meant to prevent, but it is happening. So I think what has to be happening is that we should take this matter to the boardrooms in a global business environment. A similar thing is happening here, as our guests pointed out, that the businesses in the United States is even actively lobbying against legislative initiatives, particularly on Forced Labor Prevention Act. That is unconscionable. And also on Olympics, the Uyghur people actually looking for countries to at least say, we cannot send a diplomatic mission to glorify Beijing's atrocities has been ongoing in the last 5 years. And also the Uyghur community is also looking for the governments around the world to walk away from the position of business as usual. And there's an active genocide is taking place. There are millions of Uyghurs around the world looking for their loved ones, my fellow Americans here at home. And I know for a fact have not been even able to talk to their family members. So it's past time for action. International community should come together either collectively or individually. The first thing first, they should, the governments in liberal democracies should say that we're not going to send diplomatic mission, as Speaker Pelosi recently told Congress in a hearing. That shouldn't be too difficult to do. And also we should be mindful that the international community cannot repeat the mistake of 1936 again. 3 years after the Berlin Olympics, we know what happened in the history. So it's also unfair to the athletes to compete in the backdrop of the ongoing atrocities in the concentration camps. So the Uyghur people, I can say this with certainty, that somewhat disappointed that some governments are still tiptoeing around this issue. At the same time, there's a glimmer of hope with the leadership by our friends in the UK, in the European Parliament, and here at home, that we're seeing some change. United States government has sanctioned, issued executive decision or punitive sanctions over 74 instances against individuals, entities. There's several bills in the US Congress. The same thing can be done in other capitals.
Nury's just chatting there about the US position, Sir Iain Duncan-Smith. I'm interested to get a view from you as to how you feel that has changed in the last 6-7 months when you have seen the move from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, because of course President Trump was very forceful in his words on China, and also President Biden and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, have stood by their belief of genocide being committed, although no formal ruling. That's more in chat and hearings than anything legally binding.
Oh, well, the one good thing to come out of all of this has been that in a very divided political atmosphere in many countries in the free world, but in America, if we focus on the United States has become quite divided, polarized in a way. I guess you'd argue that politics is like that, but I think in this way it got particularly polarized. But the one element of that which has been shared on both sides of the House, as it were, in the Senate and in Congress, has been their growing concern about China. It started in the Trump administration, you could say reasonably late on, but it did start. And then many of the things they started doing were picked up by President Biden and continued. And he's done some other things too. So the pressure, the declaration of genocide he did, the beginnings of them talking about making sure that technology doesn't just drift over to China, the bringing back of microprocessor technology in US is a very big decision, and that will hurt. That will hurt China. But the one thing China has not been able to catch up on is that critical element, which the US still has a lead on, the free world does, because some of it's in the UK and other countries. But microprocessor technology is important. It's been brought back now, and that's a critical issue. So the beginnings of a recognition of dependency and how you deal with it, although the US is actually still incredibly dependent on China commercially, economically, and in terms of imports. So all of that is a work in progress, but quite gratifying in one way that the US has now taken the lead in this. My concern really is that the UK's role in this, now that we're outside the European Union, what we should be doing is working with the United States and with our allies in the Five Eyes to engender a greater sense of commitment, a universal commitment amongst the free world towards. And what I would do first and foremost is to look at what I call the compendium of dependency. To what degree is the free world now dependent on China commercially? What can we do to start taking that back, changing that process, and looking at new areas? And one of the things I wrote about the other day, which worries me, which the government here and many governments have given next to no concern about or thought, and that is this rush to net zero right now, which is going on with a kind of bidding war amongst governments to be the one that looks the most determined and the quickest to get to net zero. And that's fine in terms of the climate issue, but it's not fine in terms of what then happens if you get these decisions wrong. So if we take the drive to electric power, which is becoming the dominant feature, which I think is a mistake, the problem you've got is the country with the control over the rare earth materials, which are critical for the computers and telephones and batteries, really importantly on batteries. Now that's China. They own about 85% of the rare earth mines in the world. And the biggest thing they have is the full production facility on rare earth materials, which is huge. And they dominate that. They also dominate as well battery production on a huge scale. I think almost one mega factory is opening every 3 or 4 weeks in China. So they control and dominate that dramatically, and also hugely electrical vehicle production. We talk a lot about, wanting to have electric cars, but the vast majority of those, vast majority of cars and buses are all made in China. And as I say, the battery systems. So what's actually happening as we move more to net zero without too much consideration, what we are doing is growing, or will be growing, a massive level of dependency above where we are now. So my concern right now, net zero should be an opportunity for us to break free of that. If we looked at other fuel sources properly and develop them like hydrogen, etc., in the West, we could actually break free of that, and we could ourselves be competitors. But that's not the case. So it's not just a case of complaining, quite rightly, about human rights abuses, which are critical, or slave labor, absolutely critical as well in terms of production. It's also recognizing that we need to do something about lessening that economic dependency on China, because whilst we are so economically dependent, we become reluctant to criticize China for fear that some of that becomes difficult. And you can see the consequences of that with the reluctance in the free world to hold China to book. But so it's a huge issue, and getting governments to focus on it in everything is the uphill struggle.
I can only imagine it must be an even bigger struggle when it comes to trying to encourage developing countries who need more financial assistance, to come on board. How concerned are you about China's reach in terms of building their power base within countries that are not quite as secure as perhaps parts of the West at the moment?
Is that for me?
Sorry, yes, it is.
Yeah. Well, I think the big problem is that China recognizes that your influence in these countries, because many of them are possessors of rare earth material mines, but also other areas, is critical. Because then that protects your position in the UN and counterbalances the West. And the problem for us is that the free world, when they give resources to a country, they give it with very few demands other than it's spent particularly well and on those elements that it was there for. China's money comes with big strings attached. First of all, quite often it's a loan to buy Chinese equipment. Let's take telecommunications, developments of 4 and 5G. Almost certainly, if they lend money to you or give money to you under the Belt and Road, you have to buy their product. You have to employ their companies. And in a huge number of cases, they also position a lot of people in your country, many of whom do not come back and stay there and get heavily involved in the running of that country. So you can see straight away that this isn't an act of utter generosity. This is an act of self-preservation, Belt and Road, but it's successful because if you're a country desperate for the resources and means to be able to develop your country, then China is the one standing ready to give you that. And the problem I think that we need to face up to in this particular regard is that many of those countries, certainly that I know, that I've talked to people from them, they don't want this terrible involvement, but they have no choice because the free world hasn't stepped in and offered an alternative. So we need to think about, in the contest with China, being there at every phase that they are and being there with a better offer. And the offer will be, of course, that we don't add strings to all of this. What we do is try and make sure money is spent so that those who need it actually derive the benefit from it. But other than that, very rarely do we demand, in fact, we're not really meant to, so we don't demand British product is bought, but we do obviously show them what is capable in the West generally. So my sense is that we need to think very carefully, and this is an example at every single stage, how China is very carefully trying to subvert the influence of the free world everywhere.
How optimistic are you that actually China can be stopped in that? I mean, we've got a prime minister in the UK who describes himself as a Sinophile. There is this huge dependency. I mean, do you actually think that China can be stopped? Can it even be reined in? And if it can be reined in, is that going to have any impact on the human rights abuses that we've heard so graphically from Nury?
Yeah, you're right. The Prime Minister describes himself as a Sinophile. I mean, I would describe myself as a Sinophile in many respects. My family grew up in China, so my great-grandfather set up a business in China in about 1860, 1865. trading company, really. And my grandmother and my grandmother was born there. She lived most of her working life in China, and her two children, my mother and my uncle, were born and raised in China. My uncle actually ended up speaking fluent Mandarin and also very passable Cantonese. And he ended up, sorry, well, not very good. My son did Mandarin, but my point is that, so there are three generations really of my family have been involved with China. My grandfather helped set up the Chinese postal system, originally under Sun Yat-sen and subsequently under various regional governments as well. But the real point that I make is you can be a Sinophile, but opposed to the nature of the Chinese government and what they're up to. And this is the big difference. You know, people say, oh, well, you're just anti-China. Not anti-China at all. I think there is a huge place for China in the world in a positive way, and I welcome its reemergence. But I would welcome it on the basis that it is within the lines of what we think is right, which is human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. And none of those are practiced in China. The CCP celebrates its 100th year in power, I think, this week. And I wrote a piece for the Iain newspaper to say that what is the legacy? And the legacy, whilst there is growth in China, is a devastating legacy in almost every regard in terms of human rights and the rule of law. And I think this is the key bit. So I am utterly opposed to the behavior of the CCP and their ambitions, military, economic, and global. But I am desperately in favor of the Chinese people being given the kind of rights and privileges and freedoms that exist in the free world, and to allow the people of Hong Kong, for example, to live a life that was agreed in the treaty, and for those in Taiwan to be able to make their own choices without threats from the Chinese government. So that is the difference.
Nury, we heard there about the devastating legacy. You obviously know all too well on a very personal level for you and generations of your family about that. How optimistic are you that there might be change, that we might see some difference if there is this strong international alliance shown towards China?
I never thought that I would be talking about how I arrived to this world in such a horrific situation. Literally, I'm talking about it almost every day, just to remind the world that this has been an ongoing repression by the CCP government. It's about their sense of insecurity and using the way that they see others as a potential obstacle to take out. You know, they even use the term such as using chemical to clear the weeds. So the CCP's intention is clear. They not only wanted to take out any obstacles, challenges domestically, they're also trying to spread the very method, the authoritarian dictatorship around the world. I think that's a threat to civilization in my mind, because I've lived through it. So when I talk on these issues, it's personal to me. So
because you
know,
in one of those camps.
Yeah, even though it was a different type of camp, but the repression is ongoing. It's only getting worse. So I urge the international community to look at it the broader perspective. The only positive aspect, I think, to me on these issues is that now the human rights abuses is part of the economic discussion now. Even the solar industry, the green technology has been implicated. Presidential envoy for climate change, John Kerry, even acknowledged in his testimony in Congress that Chinese solar panel industry uses forced labor. There's consumer products, electronics, technology, and China is the only country uses AI for racial profiling. The Chinese technology firms are entangled, work hand in hand with Chinese Ministry of Public Security. So these are the national security concerns, economic security concerns. These are moral issues. To the Uyghur people, they always say it should not take a genocide for the international community to wake up to this brutal regime. It should not take Hong Kong democracy, rule of law upending or destruction for the international community to realize that this is not the government that they can go about business as usual. So there's a lot of positive aspects. At the same time, we're all facing a monumental challenges down the road.
Nury, thank you for that. So Iain, Duncan Smith, we are coming close to time now. Is there anything else that you'd like to add with relation to this situation?
Well, not really. We've covered most of it, really. I'm sorry that we should be in this kind of position, but I do feel that free world governments have sleepwalked into this. Nobody has challenged the position of the governments. And the result is we have drifted really into this without much thought. We've known about these things. We've known about Belt and Road. We've known about human rights abuses. We've known about the Tibetan situation for decades. I mean, it's not as though we didn't know that what was going on in Tibet is pretty shocking. But you know what happens when Western leaders go to see the then, whoever it was at the time, the president, whether it's President Xi or anybody else, they would say, well, we raised the Tibetan issue. And what they meant was at the first meeting, they said, I will have to raise the issue of the problems in Tibet, you know, and I might say something very general. And then the president of China might say, well, these are internal matters, but I hear what you say and leave it at that. Now that is what they did. And then they moved quickly on to other things like trade and all the other bits and pieces, which meant China's never been under any pressure on anything. This is really about the first time that China has begun to feel any pressure about their behavior. I mean, they took over the South China Seas and the UN said they had no right to it. And what did they do? They just ignored them and said, well, so what? And as a result of that now, other countries that may have claim to areas in like Spratly Islands and things like that in the South China Seas, Vietnam, you know, you've got the Philippines nearby, all these countries that thought that these were shared resources find themselves locked out. It was a deliberate attempt to try and block everybody from access to what is basically, it's about raw materials. And they just did it and they don't care. I don't recall my government or any government in my country doing that much about the South China Seas. And we have this agreement with over Hong Kong, the Sino-British International Treaty, in which this was meant to go on for some years yet to come, in which they had the right of free expression. That has been stopped in contravention of the treaty. And although we've objected to that, and many other countries have objected, done much else. We've offered ways back for them, yes, but we haven't sanctioned any of the people in Hong Kong responsible for this, nor in the national government responsible for the new security law, which is out with the treaty. So, you know, what happens is Chinese government learns very quickly that the West makes a noise, but if you ignore it, the West goes away. And we went through this back in the 1930s. You know, we all told each other that what the Nazi government in Germany and the other fascist governments were after was just reasonable, that they'd been badly treated, and that therefore we just needed to let them do this and carry on with business and all would be well. There are plenty of instances where those arguments were deployed. And bit by bit by bit, they took what was on offer and moved to the next phase. And we're seeing that with the Chinese government. Every time they believe, quite rightly, that they're not being held to book, then they bank that and move on to the next area. So it is really desperate now that the free world recognizes the scale of the threat that we face. I mean, they're due to be the largest economy in the world soon, very soon, in the next 10 years or 15 years at most. And then very quickly after that, become the largest military power in the world. Now that should be worrying a government that is intolerant, dictatorial, and anti-democratic, and absolutely not law-abiding in that regard, and it fails on human rights. That to be the most powerful country on the planet is the first major challenge we have faced since the ending of the Cold War. We need to deal with that.
Iain, Duncan Smith, thank you very much for that, and also to Nusrat Ghani, who had to leave a little bit earlier. Thank you for your time. In closing comments, I'm going to hand you back to Nury, Turkel, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. This has been an illuminating conversation. I am particularly grateful to Ms. Ghani and Sir Iain Duncan Smith for their extraordinary leadership in the UK Parliament in particular, speaking truth to power and giving the very hope that is missing in the lives of millions of people who have been subject to human rights abuses in China. I'd like to end this conversation on a high note that these two leaders were sanctioned because of their work to defend human rights and democracy. Whereas the Chinese leaders, Chinese officials have been sanctioned for abusing that very right that is a part of our values, part of our lives, and supposed to be protected, not destroyed, as it has been the case in China. So with that, I express my gratitude for your leadership. And as you pointed out, we have the challenges ahead of us facing this government in Beijing. And we can only continue to do the work that we can to promote human rights, democracy, rule of law, not only in China, around the world. Thank you.
Thank you.